Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. It is March 7th in the afternoon in San Diego and March 8th, 2023 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. This is, of course, the Japan Zoomina. I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor of Japanese business here at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, JFIT. This whole thing finds you at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. More information about our programs can be found at gps.ucsd.edu. And our Japan Center is at jfit.ucsd.edu. And while the Zoom participants are still finding their seats, allow me to tell you a little bit more about us. So this is the JFIT website at jfit.ucsd.edu. You can sign up for the San Diego Japan Newsflash. And right next to that tab is a tab called Japan Zoominas, where you can find upcoming and past events. That's right. Our Zoominars are recorded. So you can look at past events. Also, what that means for today is that we invite you to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box. If I read them out, I will refer to you only by your first name to protect your privacy. While you're on that website, it would be greatly appreciated if you'd also find the support button. We are, of course, a not-for-profit organization, and we're on a very slim budget here. So we're hoping that you will consider that you can do this from your home seat. You don't have to drive to UC San Diego and park for a rapacious amount of money. Just take that and send it to us. Every single dollar is appreciated and helps us going. All right, so today, of course, we have Sam Holden, who I will introduce momentarily. Please check your calendars and make sure that you don't miss out on Andreas Dannenberg in 2 weeks from now, who's going to talk about Japan's branding strategies and Dentsu in Japanese marketing, followed by John Bradford, who is a security policy specialist. And then on April 18, 19, we'll have Lowell Shepard, who's a very cool guy. He's sailing around Japan in a very nice sailboat, and he'll tell us what's happening upon him as he moors at Japan's distant coastlines. Please watch out, folks in Tokyo. We're switching to daylight saving time this Sunday. And that means for the upcoming events, our start time will not be 9 a.m., but 8 a.m., bright and early going forward until this year is half over. Okay, so that's all I have. Let me stop my share, and here's Sam. Hello, Sam.
Hello. Thank you.
Okay, so let me introduce you. Sam Holden is an urban activist and writer. He originally hails from Denver, Colorado, and was in Japan as an AFS student in Niigata. I've once been to Niigata. I can see how you could get into the countryside stuff. This was pre-iPhone, and he and Sam could really kind of delve into the traditional way of living. He then graduated from Pomona College and was an assistant reporter with the Yomiuri Shimbun in New York before he went back to Japan in 2014 to study human geography at Waseda. Eventually that led to a master's degree from Todai with, I believe, a thesis on alternative spatial cultures in post-growth cities, which is, of course, what we're going to talk about today. Sam's website is samholden.jp. He also's got a very cool Substack that you should all look at, as well as you can follow him on Twitter, Instagram, and so forth and so on. We look forward, Sam, to talk to you about Sento and neighborhood, the little house in Tokyo, and all of that. And the way we've planned it is we'll have you introduce all of that first. So let me just hand the microphone over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Ulrike, for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for turning out. I understand there's a pretty good turnout today. So I am going to sort of start the discussion at the beginning with just an introduction of what I do, my 3 projects that I've been working on in the last 5 years. Usually I would probably take about an hour to do this, but I'm going to kind of condense that down into 15 minutes and probably leave you with a lot of questions that you're welcome to raise in the Q&A session. And then after that, we can hopefully have more of a free-ranging discussion about urban life and spatial cultures in post-growth Japan. So you just made my job a little bit easier. I don't need to really get into my background, but Alex mentioned that I got a master's degree in urban studies at the University of Tokyo in 2017 under Professor Shuni Yoshimi. And in this research, I was looking at cultures of how people were reusing vacant space in Japan. And I traveled into both urban and rural contexts all over Japan, saw how people were finding vacant spaces, how they were reusing them. And I was trying in this research to also sort of unpack some deeper questions about real estate value in a post-growth city, how we think about urban space, how it's created and how it's thought of, and whether maybe population growth is opening up some new horizons for us to think about how we can inhabit cities. And nowadays I work as a translator, writer, and editor, but my work as a renovation activist is what I call myself. That's really where I spend a lot of my time and passion. So my three projects that I'm going to talk about in order today are Tokyo Little House, which was it's a hotel, gallery, and cafe in Akasaka in central Tokyo. I built this in 2018, and then my second project is a community project outside of Tokyo in Onomichi in Hiroshima, and this is called Labyrinth House. That's been ongoing for about 2.5 years. And then the other project is Inariyu, which is a historic bathhouse in northern Tokyo. And here I worked with a nonprofit organization that I founded to renovate this space and then also create a new community space. So right when I finished my master's, my acquaintance invited me to start a small business together. This is Tokyo Little House. It's located in Akasaka, which, if you are familiar with Tokyo, is a very modern high-rise district of offices and embassies today. We took the name of the business from the children's book by Virginia Lee Burton about a little house in the countryside that becomes surrounded by the city, because our house followed a similar course, except instead of being built in a rural field, it was built in a field of ruins after World War II. The house is located a stone's throw away from the parliament and the prime minister's office, and Akasaka was completely destroyed in an air raid in May 1945. This is an image of the neighborhood about 2 weeks after the surrender, taken from a B-29. Our little house was built in the ruins in 1948 by my colleague's grandparents, who had once lived in Schaede. Over the years, the first floor was rented out to many businesses while the family lived upstairs. And you can see that Akasaka was really a very typical residential neighborhood in Tokyo up until the point of around the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Very typical sort of low rise wooden architecture and residential buildings. This became sort of a center for the redevelopment of the city beginning in the 1964 Olympics. The neighborhood actually also even had 2 bathhouses, the closest of which sat in the shadow of Tokyo's biggest cabaret. Of course, today nobody thinks of Akasaka as a residential neighborhood. It has been fully transformed into an office district of concrete, steel, and glass towers, and is today an address with cachet in the global real estate market. So our intention in preserving this 75-year-old living space at the heart of Tokyo is to turn it into a window onto the city's past. I think to first-time visitors to Tokyo, the city appears to be sort of stuck relentlessly in the present, but it's also a product of its complex history that we don't oftentimes see anymore on the surface because it's been redeveloped. So the second floor of the house is now a hotel, and you can see the living room appears much as it once did, but the windows open onto sort of the neon city outside. The first floor is a small 12-seat cafe, and in this space, we display images of the ruined post-World War II city from the US military archives. And I think that actually presenting these pictures in a geographic context makes it possible to think about the firebombing as more than just sort of an abstract historical tragedy, but actually as an ending and a starting point for the city itself. We also have a library of English guidebooks, magazines, maps, and other things from over half a century. So we want people to sort of come into this space and be able to discover something about the history of Tokyo that you wouldn't ordinarily find. Very condensed, as I said. But my second project that I've been working on for the last couple of years is Inariyu, which is a traditional bathhouse or sento in northern Tokyo. And whereas Tokyo Little House is a small business, this project is a historical preservation project that we conducted at a pre-existing and still operating bathhouse. Inariyu is located near Itabashi. So if you're familiar with Tokyo, a bit north of Ikebukuro and Sugamo, it's sort of on the edge of the urban core. And for this project, I worked with a different group of colleagues to fund a nonprofit that we called Sento and Neighborhood. After making a connection with Inariyu, we first helped them to register the property as a cultural property in Japan. And then someone recommended that we apply to the World Monuments Fund in New York, which provides grants for historic preservation around the world. This foundation gave us a six-figure grant to use at the bathhouse in 2020. So let me just provide sort of a quick word about why I'm drawn to Sento. I see bathhouses really as pieces of Tokyo's original urban commons. In other words, they're a part of a neighborhood fabric that is created from the bottom up by the residents of the city themselves. And these sorts of spaces are held together by human relationships more than market transactions. And this is really where most of life unfolded in the city until the late 20th century, when development sort of overtook many of these spaces. I'm just going to give you an idea of what I mean. Let me just quote myself from an essay I wrote a couple of years ago. The ubiquitous bathhouses, more than 2,500 at their peak, were located every few hundred meters in most residential neighborhoods, contributing to making Tokyo a spatially egalitarian metropolis. Most of the time, a bath formed a center of a little urban microcosm, a tofu shop, a fishmonger, a place to share beers or have a bite to eat, synchronizing the rhythms of local neighborhoods to the tune of daily perspiration. There were about 2,500 of these in the 1960s. So they blanketed the city, and around each of them was a little urban ecosystem, like I just mentioned. Today, they're being knocked down and turned into apartment buildings and parking lots. And in the process, those ecosystems around them also unravel. As in terms of their architecture, traditional bathhouses like Inariyu are really spectacular pieces of artistry. Inariyu was built by a team of temple carpenters and features ornate design features like gardens and the coffered ceiling. And of course, the most emblematic symbol of Tokyo bathhouses is the Fuji painting above the baths. As part of this project, we did seismic reinforcement and had a craftsman repaint the painting fresh on the wall. It still looks beautiful today. But what made this project at Inariyu really an interesting opportunity for me and our team was that it was not just a chance to refurbish the bathhouse, but also to create a new neighborhood space in the structure next door. So there is a 2-room Nagoya building, a tenement, that was moved to this site in 1927 and is now around the corner from Inariyu. In this part of the project, we were inspired by the history of actually Edo-era bathhouses that once had a second-floor space where after you would bathe, the patrons would go upstairs, they'd drink tea, they'd play Go, they'd chat. And in more modern times, you can still find a similar atmosphere in sort of the local liquor shops that are known as kakuuchi, which you find close to Sento. This is my local one. And this is where sort of neighbors can come together and sit and talk over a drink. This is really the kind of sociality that we want to foster. So when we first entered this space, it had been abandoned and was in great need of repair. The pillars had all sunk, so at the beginning we stripped it down to its foundations, and we worked with a number of craftsmen to rebalance the building and structurally reinforce it. Also, because the work was supported by this historic preservation foundation in New York, we did as much as possible to use traditional methods in its reconstruction. So for the walls, I traveled 14 hours by dump truck to Nagano to buy a load of wall building mud from this grandmother, who's one of the last people who still makes it, and carry this back to Tokyo. And we hosted a number of community workshops where people could learn about the process of building walls in the traditional method with bamboo and mud. So in the process of building, we were also trying to create the community around the bathhouse. And you can kind of see the result of that is this sort of multi-stage wall building process. We opened this space, which we call Inari Nagaya, in June 2022. And we now open it on the weekends during bathing hours, so people can take a bath and then they can walk around the corner and come here to relax afterwards. We restored half of the space to what it used to look like. And then on the other side of the space, we added a kitchen and made it more comfortable for older people to come in with a low floor. And on occasion, we will have a morning bath and serve breakfast. And we've actually been very satisfied in the last half year with being able to attract a really wide cross-section of the community, from families with little children to older people. And it has really sort of validated our belief that the Sento is a very special place within the city where people from all walks of life and all ages come together, and it's possible to sort of create those local community connections here in a way that is not possible in many other spaces. We also do sort of markets or exhibitions and things, and the project has been covered by a lot of media in the last 6 months or so. Okay, so the last project that I'll discuss is my project outside of Tokyo in Onomichi in Hiroshima Prefecture, and this is still very much ongoing. If Little House is a small business and Inariyu is historic preservation, this one is something more of a social experiment to explore the possibilities of vacant houses to create new community. It began when my friend from Tokyo began living in Onomichi and gathered a group of friends to do some repairs on his house. We thought it might take a few weeks, and 2.5 years later, we just finished our 18th week of construction, and there's really no end in sight. Some of you might be familiar with Onomichi from films such as Tokyo Story or as a tourist destination. I became fascinated with Onomichi 8 years ago in the context of my research into renovation culture. Onomichi has some very special features, the main one being that there are no roads on the hillside in the center of town. And that means that under existing or current Japanese building law, no new construction can take place. So sort of the whole center of the community is preserved on this hillside. And because you can't do new construction, most of the houses are vacant and they don't have any real estate value. So this has seeded a whole local culture of renovation as migrants come and they start little bakeries and libraries and coffee shops and pursue their interests. Rent is oftentimes about $100 or less, and many people oftentimes also receive their houses or spaces for free. There's also a very active NPO that renovates old spaces into guest houses and other community spaces. In our case, we received 3 houses for free. I can get into this in more detail in the questions if people want to know how that actually happened. And here we started to do construction and very quickly realized that the entire structure was eaten through by termites and was in very bad condition because of water damage and other things. So we stripped it down to its foundations and did a bunch of structural reinforcement. And then we sort of rebuild the spaces after that, adding new floors and ceilings and equipment. And this is a project that I'm just doing with my friends. Everyone involved there's no professionals involved. It's all volunteer. We pay for the construction ourselves. We have to carry all of the building materials up the hill. We're probably about, I would say, 8 stories or 10 stories up. And so we have to carry them through this temple grounds to our house. So termites, rain damage, no cars. I think maybe you can start to get an idea of why the houses here are free. And then in order to avoid having to take trash down the hill. We tried to burn a lot of it on site. We lived together while we did the construction. And I would say that one of the interesting things about this project is it's really a form of informal architecture. We have a joke in Onomichi that it's sort of a favela, but there's, in many ways, I don't think there's anything unusual about what we are doing. We're building a house together as people have done for thousands of years and still do in all sorts of informal contexts around the world. It's only in the late 20th century that the house has become purely a product we purchase on the market and a financial instrument. And so we're sort of trying through this project to explore what an alternative idea of a house can be. We design it as we build, so there's no architect. We kind of just decide, all right, let's build something here, and then we discuss as we go, and I build a little 3D model like this. So we're currently at this stage here where we still have a lot of work to go on what is now the second house. We've already renovated one, and we're working on the second house now. So you can see sort of, you can see sort of all of the houses here, the front house on the left and then the back house on the right. What are we building here? We are trying to turn the back house into sort of a general store for the neighborhood where people could buy daily necessities, things like soy sauce or toilet paper, because most of the people that live on this hillside are very elderly. And in order to go shopping, you have to climb all the way down the stairs and walk quite a ways. So we want to have a little general store. We're building a library, and then we want it to be sort of a flexible community space that people can use for all sorts of events and other things, probably to be completed around 2024. And if you're interested in this project, as Ulrike mentioned, you can subscribe to my Substack. I'm going to be sending out a lot of updates about this in April. But this sort of gets back to our interest in sort of the possibilities of these vacant spaces. We received the house for free, so we have a desire to do something here that is not really market driven. We're not profit motivated in this project. We want to see what other possibilities there are for this space. And I won't, I'll kind of leave this open-ended so we can get into the discussion. And if we need to, I can show some more images and things. But just a few thoughts for discussion. People oftentimes ask me about bathhouses and ask me about vacant houses in different, separately. And I've come to realize that for me, they're really two sides of the same coin. I think that bathhouses are really a part of this urban commons that survives from the early 20th century, the period of growth. And I see vacant houses as sort of the potential for a new sort of urban commons in the post-growth era. You have all these vacant places that we can say, open up and create new forms of community and sociality there. So my interest really lies in the social function of these spaces, even more than the buildings themselves. And then I think we're also at a period of time now at the end of the period of growth where we really sort of have to rethink the value of urban space and how we think about the urban space and development at this juncture. So I can talk a little bit about that in the discussion. And I think both of these things really get back to why I chose to come back to Japan in the first place. I sort of saw Japan entering the post-growth period and thought that this was the future, not just for Japan, but for the rest of the world. And a lot of these questions about how we use space and how we think about cities, they really are connected to larger questions about our cultural values, our way of life. And I think they offer a lot of lessons for life after growth in other places as well. So before we jump into the discussion, I'll just mention one more quote from an essay I wrote a few months ago. I don't really mean to contend that the post-growth future is not going to be sort of innovation and transformation and progress. But I do think that we can sort of learn to live in the ruins of the past and create a culture that mourns what we are losing in the present. And in that process, I think we can find a way towards a less dystopian future. So that's a lot for everyone to digest, but I thought it would be important for us to kind of have a basis for understanding where I come from. And we can go into the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. That was terrific. And I actually had a note here to ask you why you're doing what you're doing, and you kind of took us there, right? So, and there is, it's not just that in Japan there's a lot of this longing for the past, or everybody gets excited about a particular, people from Tokushima love their noodle soups better than any other, but there's also a sort of a tradition around the Sento that is very communal, and that I know a lot of Japanese who think it's a bad thing that it's going away, and that they want their children to learn how one behaves in those spaces. And I also note, as a footnote, that a lot of the newly created business hotels actually are bringing a Daiokujo back, right? That I've noticed a lot of places where one can use one, and they're always crowded. So there is a demand for what you put your finger on an important spot. So what is the Japanese reaction to your activities? I mean, do they think that here's a henna gaijin, sort of foreigner comes in and buys these old Akiya that nobody wants, or is there an appreciation, or what's the reaction you get on these activities?
Well, I think one of the important things about that question is that in all three of these projects, I'm not working on my own. I'm actually the only foreigner in all of my colleagues in all three projects are Japanese. So I'm really doing this in the context of sort of an established local form of activism. And I think when we talk about social activism in Japan, people do oftentimes point out that social activism on a large scale in terms of impacting political systems and big social questions doesn't happen really in the same way that it happens in many other societies. But I think actually what I've found in my research and now in my life since is that when you go into the local level and you go into local communities, this form of local social entrepreneurship or activism around reusing spaces like this, it's pretty broad-based. And so people understand what I do, I think, in that context, that I'm trying to, preserve some of these spaces that are meaningful to the community. I would also say, though, that we're getting to a point, as you mentioned, that bathhouses are disappearing, and I think a lot of Japanese people nowadays have more of an appreciation for the value of these spaces than they might have 20 years ago. There's a difference, I think, between when bathhouses have been declining for half a century, but when there's still a lot left, people can still kind of say, oh, too bad this one closed, but there's one down the street. We're getting to the point in Tokyo where there are really very few of these places left. And so that's, I think, created more awareness about the importance of preserving them.
Can you talk a little bit more about why it is important to preserve those? I mean, if I were a technocrat, I would just tell you that, the shower at home is much better, and it's faster, and, and all kinds of reasons why progress is good. What drives you to sort of say, well, hold it for a second? Maybe not all progress is good.
Sure. Well, I think in many ways, the bathhouses and the neighborhoods that are around them, they're sort of the quintessential form of good, human-scaled urbanism, the sort of stuff that James Jacobs talks about, or urbanists all around the world talk about. I go to my local bathhouse and I see familiar faces, neighbors, older people, and then I stop by my local pub. I stop by my grocer, my fishmonger. I do all of these things in the context of daily life, and that really creates, I think, a lot of important social connections that, create a rich urban environment. I think one of the dangers that Japan faces at this point is that as we continue to lose these spaces, the newer places that are being developed in Tokyo, they don't have this potential, I think, for sort of local community in the same way. And as we lose that, people are becoming more, atomized or more separate in society, and that's particularly dangerous in a aging society. Most of the customers at bathhouses are old people, and when they go to a bathhouse, if you're 80 or 85, you get to see your neighbors. That's a very important, thing for maintaining people's health as well.
So, so why are these places disappearing? I mean, is this just an ugly story of development, or is there nobody like you who takes ownership in these? Because they're done, right? They're old. It takes a lot to rebuild them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you put your finger on it a minute ago in saying a lot of people obviously don't feel a necessity to go to bathhouses anymore because they have baths at home. But it's a lot of factors. It's a lack of heirs to take over the business. It's the aging of the facilities. It's the increase this year, especially of gas prices to actually heat the baths. And then it's also just the sort of ongoing pressure for redevelopment, even though Tokyo now is at a point where the population is not really growing anymore. I think if we step back a bit to explain some of those development pressures, Tokyo, since the post-war period, I think the whole structure of the city and the development system has been to sort of increase the supply of housing and space, first to address the housing shortages that they had after the war. And then as the economy started to stagnate in the 1990s, the government decided, okay, we'll sort of deregulate zoning laws to encourage developers to build more and kind of keep the economy running. The problem, I think, now that we're at a point where the population is no longer growing, is if we continue down that path of continuing to develop more and more and lose some of the cultural and community heritage we have, we're going to reach a point where we're already at the point where that additional development is no longer, I think, making the city richer. I think it's actually making the city less rich by forcing us to lose all of these things.
Yeah, I just got back from Tokyo, and I think for the first time it hit me how many of these hills are there, and we really don't need more hills. And for those of you who don't know what this is, basically a word for another high-rise building that has maybe some office, some hotel, or even some apartments, but it's just too much glass and cement and coal. So I'm really quite excited about all the effort you put in there. Are you alone, or is this a new movement?
I think, as I mentioned, I'm doing this in the context of a very active group of younger activists and community activists that you can find in any city in Japan. The big question, I think, is, is that going to really be enough to sort of stem the tide of what's going on? I don't think, I don't want to blow out of proportion what we're doing. I think it still is very much a sort of a subculture or a minor trend in comparison to all of the development that continues to go on. But as you said, I mean, I look around Tokyo as well, and I don't think, what the city needs is another shopping mall. I think we're well past the point where the sort of development that's going on is creating added value.
So we get a lot of questions from the audience now, and I'm trying to bring them together here. Several of the audience are worried, I guess, or have asked about the financials and wondering whether you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, this is costly. I mean, I looked at the Tokyo little house and I thought, it would be cool to stay here, or, let's stop for a coffee. But that would hardly be enough to sustain it. So can you talk a little bit about what it takes for this to become a larger movement? I mean, do we need to do this on donations, or is there a point where this could actually sustain itself?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think since the post-war period, the system in Japan is not really built to preserve old buildings. It's built to destroy them. And to give you just one example, for example, the way the inheritance tax works, if you inherit a building, you're assessed, a tax on the land that could be 40, 50%. And the way that most people have dealt with that, and the way that the system was designed to encourage, is people knock the building down, they subdivide the land, they build more housing, maybe they sell one of the houses to pay the tax. So over time, this was, a very effective way for Tokyo to address, housing shortages and things like that. In terms of how are we going to preserve the rest of the bathhouses that are in Tokyo, there has to be some way for these businesses to pay their inheritance tax, to rebuild their infrastructure and things like that. So certainly in the case of bathhouses, for example, what my organization is trying to do is to bring in a sort of donation from a foundation, and really make the case that although this is a private business, this is something that is a really valuable public asset for the city, and we need to preserve it. I'm worried, though, that of course, before any really drastic changes to that system are made, that most of what we still have will disappear. On the other hand, to speak a little bit about the financials of what I do in Onomichi, that's a very different situation. Because, of course, as I mentioned, I received all of those houses for free. So there, we're kind of operating in this context where the real estate is not exactly real estate; it's more like resources that we found, and we can just apply our own energy and money to be utilizing those. So that's one, I think, vision of, or one premonition of what the future of Japan is going to be. Maybe 30, 40 years from now, you're going to have a lot of vacant houses, abandoned properties all over the country. And I would argue that there's still some potential in those places. But that doesn't necessarily, that's a very different context than what's going on in Tokyo.
But I think the data bear this out, right? You might be at the cusp of this new movement of moving away from Tokyo and going back to, maybe, so Onomichi is not that far, it's Hiroshima, right? So you can get there. And there are other places along the Shinkansen where people say, well, we don't need this, this very hard life in Tokyo where you're constantly running after a train and that sort of thing. And so maybe there's something there. The new construction has always bothered me, but why is it that in Japan we see this so often? The house is 25, 30 years old and it's just torn down and built from scratch. What's the logic behind that? Do you know?
Well, I mean, a lot of that is just related to the way that the system has operated since the post-war period. A house like Little House, which is built in 1948, for example, the carpenter who built that house had been digging bomb air raid shelters during the war. And in 1948, there were restrictions on the sort of building materials that you could get. So in that rebuilding phase, people adopted a mentality that you build what you can with what you have. And we're entering this phase of growth. We're going to be richer 25 years from now. We'll knock it down and we'll rebuild something then. And I think that mentality still persists into the present in a way where there's a very strong bias in Japan towards believing that older buildings have no value. The underlying land may have value, but the older buildings themselves do not. And that is something that I think is very much a product of that period of growth, and something that we need to move away from in the future if we want to preserve buildings.
So Alan has a very hands-on question. I'm curious to hear your answer. How resilient is mud as a building material?
That's interesting as well, actually. The government, until recently, basically did not even recognize any structural capacities of mud walls. They recently changed the rules a little bit to say that they have a little bit of structural capacity. But if you talk to older carpenters and you study the ways that sort of Japanese buildings used to be designed with these flexible structures, it's actually a fairly resilient form of architecture. If an earthquake were to come, the building will shake and the mud will fall off, and that's actually also a form of absorbing the shock of an earthquake. In our case, though, we did some modern structural refitting on the building, and then we restored the mud walls in a portion of the building. So we did kind of both ways of doing it.
Well,
it takes about 6 months.
They figured something out in the
Yeah.
Tokugawa period, right? That what would
Yeah.
resist all these withstand the earthquakes, but it can't be properly insulated, right? It must be really cold in the winter.
Yeah, I think that's true. But again, one of the things with these old buildings that I find value in is that an older building in Japan is actually very porous in the sense that, it's open to the outside, and that'll make it cold in the wintertime, but it also makes it very easy for a renovation person like me to come in and say, I want to open this up to the outside. The way that the modern construction works, and the logic of modern construction is really to create a sealed space, to put lots of insulation in, and kind of close it to the outside. And so as we lose these older spaces, I think we're also losing the potential in the future to turn them into something else. I don't think that the houses that are being built now are going to have the same potential 50 years from now that the old buildings I'm working with today have.
Yeah. Oh, but in the old days, they were made to last, and the new ones aren't, right? So it sounds as if a lot of the challenges you face are actually old standing regulations or Showa period, Showa growth era period things. So for instance, I believe there's a price regulation on what you can charge for the sento. But then also, of course, you mentioned the taxes. Then you mentioned that Onomichi, there's all of this, you can't build a street because, or there's no street, so you can't build a house. And that's an advantage. So what can be done to change the mind of the regulators and maybe get some people in Kazumi-Gaseki excited about this, which is, of course, the seat of the bureaucracy. And they say, why don't we deregulate some of this? And if you could deregulate this, what would you deregulate first?
On that front, I think one of the big changes that's taken place in the last 10 years, and gets back to your first question as well, is in many ways inbound tourism is has a very positive impact on how people value these places, because as inbound tourism sort of exploded in the last decade, all of a sudden, every local community was seeing projects appear where people were renovating old shop houses and they were turning them into, accommodations for foreign tourists. And a lot of people in those communities who hadn't necessarily valued these spaces in the past realized, oh, this has a lot of value. We need to preserve these things. So I do see sort of the role of inbound tourism as being a positive force in preservation. Of course, that's what Little House is as well. But I think another thing we have to do, though, is just reassess what are really the goals of our urban development. And for example, with bathhouses, these places, they provide all of these sort of social benefits that I mentioned for older people, for a lot of things that the administration and the government tries to solve through different means. If you have isolated elderly, they're paying for other programs to deal with that. We need to start to see those places as something that have these really broad-based benefits and offer some forms of support for them to survive. I don't know if in terms of deregulation, I would say, I don't know if it's a deregulation so much as, for example, I would consider abolishing I would make it easier to designate a lot of these older buildings as historic properties, and then I would get rid of the inheritance tax or greatly reduce the inheritance tax on those things. That would make a big difference in preserving a lot of bathhouses. And there are a lot of things you could do like that to offer new ways for old buildings to survive.
Great. Yeah, I hope that that could happen. I don't see why there's no tax income anyway, because people are not paying the taxes. That's why the Akia are free, right? So the Ministry of Finance would lose nothing. So maybe we can make that happen somehow. Let's work on that. So we have a few questions on your vision. So Andrea wonders, can you explain what you mean by Japan entering the post-growth era and what that looks like to you? And Andrew's wondering whether you're also considering integrating new technologies like drone delivery for the general store, or some telepresence for the shared social spaces. So marrying the old with the new in this vision of the post-growth era. Are you thinking about that at all, or are you more in the here and now?
No, I mean, I do think about the future quite a bit in what I'm doing. And what I mean when I'm talking about the post-growth era is that we are really entering now this period of unprecedented and really unstoppable demographic decline. And if you look at that on a longer scale, it's going to make a very big impact on the real estate market, for example, economic demand. And so I sort of see that as something that is inevitable that we have to adapt to. When I look at the way that, like, as I've mentioned, urban development still takes place, it's almost as if the system still wants to kind of run the same old playbook that it has been since the post-war period, as a way of sort of fixing this problem, as if we can sort of, we can build another skyscraper and we can keep the economy running. I see a lot of danger in that, because I think that over the long run, we can kind of overdevelop the city and lose all of this heritage, and we're going to sort of see a crash down the road. So I really want to sort of, what I see what I'm doing in the present as a way of trying to adapt to this reality on our own terms, to kind of preserve what we can and move towards something new. It's interesting about the question about new technology. I'll say that new technology already plays a huge role in how people use these spaces, how migrants to the rural areas live. For example, in Onomichi, on our building project, we use Amazon a ton. And we're built in the middle of a building project. We can go on our smartphones and order a component, and a delivery guy carries it up the hill the next day. It's amazing. And I think being connected to those sorts of economic systems is the only way that we can really imagine living in those places nowadays. So we definitely want to be open to that sort of thing. But partly, I think also what I do and what a lot of my colleagues do that are interested in this sort of use of old space, a lot of it is about placing emphasis on the value of sort of in-person connection, spontaneous, interactions, the sort of things that really are the foundations of healthy urbanism. And I think that, those are not the sort of things that you necessarily get from algorithms, or you get from, very technologically dense environments. So we kind of go both ways on that question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the thing is that people are social beings, and this vision of robots helping elderly people get in and out of the bath it's just not nearly as attractive as a public bathhouse with four generations coming together, right? And so I think that's really the whole thing, and it keeps people younger too. So we have a question by Jill, who wonders, how do you rely on for questions when you make these structures authentic? Yeah, are you reading up on all these carpentry books? And also James wonders, what are the key challenges when restoring public baths and vacant houses, and what's next? Is there more in this sort of category?
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of years for me has really been a constant learning experience. I've been working with all these carpenters and craftsmen and trying to pick up as much as possible. In the projects I've done so far, I've taken very different approaches to that question. So in the case of the bathhouse, it was a historic preservation project, and we really took pains to to do things in a way that was similar to how they had been done originally. And that does involve a lot of research, a lot of discussion with craftspeople. What we're doing in Onomichi is a little bit different. We're not really focused on restoring a space so much as using it in a new way. And we're also, the condition of the space necessitates us really drastically changing it. But we also feel that in the case of Onomichi, that's sort of in line with the tradition, the sort of tradition of vernacular architecture that's already there. People have been in Onomichi because they were living in this hillside. They didn't build these houses right away. They kind of built a house and then they added an addition and addition and addition. And we're kind of doing the same thing nowadays. What was the second question?
The key challenges and what's next? I mean, so you got a public bath, you got the vacant houses. Is there anything else in this sort of category that comes to mind? I mean, the Shoten guy, or I don't know.
Absolutely. I see bathhouses connected to the whole neighborhood around them, and that's why we named our organization Sento Neighborhood. We have ambition, to save other bathhouses or to help other bathhouses around the country. It's just a question of whether we can find funding to do things like that. Right now, we don't have any funding for another project. In Onomichi, I think I see what we're doing really as part of sort of seeding or nourishing a culture in that local community for people to continue to use other houses in the vacant houses. There's about 500 vacant houses in that central area of Onomichi. And if people can come to our project and be inspired to realize it's possible to sort of, forge a way of living here in this informal way, then maybe other people will do it and the community will survive into the future. Those are sort of my ambitions, I would say.
And I did the plug earlier, but James wonders what's the best way to visit. I live in Tokyo and would love to see these places. And so I think you start with your website maybe and read up on them. But is there a way to get involved, I guess, is what he's wondering.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I spend my time in these three spaces. So if you're interested in visiting, you can send me an email and I can. So
it's just samholden.jp. Yeah. Would get you started, right? So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So what the regulars on the Japan Zoomina know that I like to end the hour with this question from my mentor Hugh Patrick, who has learned over the years that this is really gets people to reflect on things in a larger way. What worries you most, and in the specific field of renovating versus redevelopment?
Yeah, well, I think I worry most about most of what we still have left disappearing before people realize how valuable it is. The sorts of buildings that I'm working with, they're built before the war or soon after the war, this sort of traditional wooden architecture. That sort of architectural heritage sort of disappeared greatly after the 1970s. So the sorts of vacant houses that we see nowadays, or the bathhouses that we still have, those are the things that are being destroyed right now. They're sort of the last, they're the last of a certain kind of structure. And if we don't preserve those things now and knock them down, I think we're going to have a lot less of a rich urban environment in the future. I think, I think that has a whole range of sort of social consequences, as I think you guys have heard through my talk. It's not just about the architectural value, it's about the kind of social connections and interactions that are possible in the city. So my hope and my ambition really in this work is not just to preserve the buildings, but also in a sense to enact a form of cultural change. If there are more people who value this stuff and want to live in ways that nourish these spaces, then maybe more of them will survive. But if we don't do that, I do think that there is a very dystopian potential for the future in Japan, where most people are isolated and aging, and the cities are increasingly full of derelict buildings and things like that. In many ways, that future is unavoidable. But the important thing, I think, is to really figure out a way in that context to create some sort of new positive vision of what a city can be.
And what can we do? What would push this forward against the technocrats' vision of another high-rise building?
Well, I mean, it really, in my belief, it really starts at the local level, and people taking action to do these sorts of renovation projects, or to save just a single bathhouse. These actions do have a lot of impact. But I think another part of it as well is to try to create a larger narrative about where we're headed in the future. I really look at Tokyo and I look at Japan, and I don't think there is a vision, a very strong vision in Tokyo for what does it mean to be a post-growth metropolis? How are we going to make this into a flourishing place 20, 30 years from now when the population is much lower than it is today? And I think if we were to take that question seriously and build a vision, it would involve changing a lot of these, systems and structures that I've mentioned, things like the inheritance tax, things like, that are causing these buildings to disappear. So it's at a local level, and it's also at that level of sort of a bigger vision.
Yeah, so that's interesting. We have a large number of questions that would open up a whole nother hour, which is this anchoring this on the building itself is, of course, a very clever way of showing what's needed. But we can presumably build a nicer version of Tokyo even after we've lost some of these old bathhouses. I mean, there could be a new version or so what is the value of having the original building in this story? I mean, could we just say, let's just make the hotels nicer, or and with nicer, I mean more communal and social and so forth. What's the value of having the old Inari-yu standing there? Is it because it has an authority over us, or the history becomes the magnet?
Yeah, well, I think it is very symbolic of sort of a different way of life that is in many ways drastically unlike what you find in a more modern district. But again, I think I do agree that there's potential to recreate many of these positive things in new buildings. So I'm not completely pessimistic on that front.
But it would be better if we could preserve them because they're so wonderful, right?
It would be better if we could preserve them. And it comes down as well to what are the forces behind creating these spaces. As I mentioned, bathhouses were really created in this bottom-up process. Most of the urban development that happens now is sort of imposed from the top down. The book of the moment in Tokyo urbanist circles is Emergent Tokyo. And in that book, they talk about corporate urbanism. Sort of being as being sort of this form of space that is created in the city where it's really sort of pre-programmed in many ways how we're supposed to interact and behave in those sort of spaces, big high rises and things. The bottom-up city is sort of created organically, and that's something that once it's lost, it is very hard to reconstruct. I think it takes a lot of effort. So I hope there are more people in the future who take the effort to do that.
Well, thank you. I think this is a wonderful point. Unfortunately, we have to stop. There have been many, many questions. Thank you, audience. But this bottom-up city, that really speaks to me as something that shapes its own thing, and no developer, even if they put a a communal bath at the top floor of the hotel. No developer will ever be able to recreate that. So thank you, Sam, for everything you're doing. It was really fantastic. And I will make sure I for one will make sure to go to the little house and stop over for coffee every time I'm in town. Audience, thank you for joining us today. And in 2 weeks, we shall meet again. Let me remind you again that daylight saving times will mean that in Japan, the upcoming Zoominars will all start at 8 a.m. And we'll talk next about Dentsu and the particular way of Japanese marketing. So thank you again, Sam Holden. It was wonderful to have had you. And everybody, I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
And with that, goodbye.